Hello, everybody. My name is Tabang Altabe, and today we are going to present a mini lecture. Today, I will be teaching two major concepts from this week's chapter. Firstly, we are going to talk about latent learning, and secondly, we are going to talk about observational learning. Now, these ideas help us understand that learning is not always visible and that it doesn't always depend on rewards, but they do show that animals and people can learn through quiet, passive, and even socially without anyone necessarily teaching them in an intentional way. On the question why this topic matters, now, this topic matters to me because it challenges the traditional behaviorist view that learning can only happen when our behavior is reinforced. But in real life, we all know that we learn things long before we ever show them. And we also form mental maps and habits without realizing it. And we pick up our behaviors from the people around us, even when no one is rewarding us for doing so. Now, understanding these forms of learning gives us a more complete perspective as to how we human beings actually learn. Now, if you were to ask me what is latent learning, I would say that latent learning is learning that often happens in the background without any reinforcement. Now, over here, there's no reward, no punishment, and no obvious motivation behind the learning ability because the learning stays hidden until a situation makes it useful, which often is in the future. Now, what this does to us is that it shows that learning and performance are not necessarily the same thing. You can learn something before you can ever demonstrate it in a real sense or real life scenario. One of the most important studies based on latent learning is derived from Edward Tolman's maze experiment, where he tested three groups of rats in a maze. Group number one never received food. Group number two always received food at the end of the maze. And then group three received no food for the first 10 days, but then suddenly they got food on day 11. What was surprising about this experiment was that group number three, as soon as food appeared, they immediately performed just as well as the group that was always given food, which is in this case was group number two. What this meant was they had already learned the maze. They just had no reason to show it before. And so Tolman concluded that the rats had formed a cognitive map, which is a mental representation of the maze. Now, this is our strong evidence that learning can occur without any reinforcement whatsoever. A real world example of latent learning is if you can imagine yourself exploring a new campus without making an effort to memorize anything in the campus. And then later on, when you actually need to go somewhere, you suddenly recall where you need to go. Now, at that moment, while you were touring the campus initially, you were not rewarded for learning it, but the knowledge was there all along. This is a typical example of what latent learning is in an everyday life situation. Now, let us transition to observational learning. Observational learning is the type of learning that you acquire by watching others and by imitating their behavior. Now, over here, you don't need reinforcement yourself, but rather you can learn from someone else's consequences. And this type of learning is especially important within our childhood era, but then it also continues throughout our life. Bandura's a Bobo doll study. Albert Bandura demonstrated observational learning by using the famous Bobo doll experiment. Now, over here, children watched an adult behave aggressively towards a large inflatable doll. But then later, when the children were given the chance to play, a large majority of them imitated the same aggressive behavior towards the door, even though they were never rewarded for doing so. Now, what this showed us is that people can learn behavior simply by observing others, and it helped shape modern social learning theory that we utilize today. A typical example of observational learning in a real world scenario is based on how children copy their parents' habits and behaviors, particularly when it comes to certain reactions. Now, kids watch how adults handle stress, how they communicate, and even how they treat their peers. They absolutely absorb these behaviors without anyone intentionally teaching them to do so, because it is a psychological wiring within us. Now, on the other hand, adults do this too, particularly when we learn how to behave in a new job by observing other co-workers. If you were to ask me a question as to why these concepts matter, I would say these concepts matter because they explain how much learning can happen in a passive way, because we don't always need reinforcement to learn something new, and we also don't always show what we have learned immediately. And we are constantly learning from the people around us, even if we don't realize it yet. Latent learning and observational learning can help illustrate real world behavior in a way that classical conditioning alone could not. And now we have come to our conclusion. To conclude, we have to understand that latent learning is hidden learning that becomes visible whenever it is useful to recall it. And on the other hand, observational learning is learning by watching other people. Now, both concepts challenge the strict behaviorist views, and they show that learning is a much more complex topic than reinforcement. If we were to combine these two concepts together, they would help us understand how human beings and even animals tend to adapt, explore, and learn from their environments. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching my lecture.